Objectivity is the ability to perceive something without weighted bias, while cognitive dissonance is the concept of holding two opposing thoughts, both seen to be true at the same time. Are we capable of simultaneously applying these concepts to a single premise? And if so, to what degree? What happens to this capability when the premise also evokes highly emotive reactions? There are many cases where we are challenged to consider our own personal opinions and feelings against the rigid explanations of right, wrong, and the letter of the law. What if we have a story that seemingly has no villain, however? What if instead we merely uncover the culmination of tragic circumstances driven by mental illness that tear a family apart? In this case, there was no monster hiding in the shadows, nor a criminal waiting for their moment to strike. Rather, a mentally declining time bomb with an ever-shortening fuse to an impending explosion. So can we consider performance over personality? And what happens when the context and emotional connection becomes greater than the content and circumstances that creates it? We've asked before if we're capable of letting go of the paradigm we think we know in place of a differently formed perspective. And it is no different on this, the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I'm again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome, listeners. Here we go.
Absolutely. Look, before we begin, a huge thank you to everyone listening. If you haven't heard our previous episodes in this series around mental health and the legal system, we would strongly recommend and greatly appreciate you heading straight over to iTunes, Spotify, whatever platform you listen on. Subscribe, rate, review, leave us a 5-star rating if you can. You know, that is how you can help us get our work out to the masses into what we call the podosphere. And you can also catch up on the journey so far. For this episode, and similar to all of those in this series, if you find anything we discuss distressing or have someone who you know or think is in a vulnerable mental state, please make use of the following support resources locally. Please sort out your own if you are interstate or international. The South Australian Government Mental Health Triage Service on 131465. You're a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week service that provides advice and information on mental health, emergency and crisis situations. And also the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line on 131466. If you have someone in a vulnerable state or situation, we said they will call on your behalf and they will help them through that time. Sean, as we begin this next episode, it is an extension of our mental health and the legal system series. However, we want to start this case off a little differently.
That's right, because this case is a little different, and it's why we've been doing all this groundwork until now. Last couple of episodes, we've talked about the difference between determining someone's mental incompetence and the objective elements of what would otherwise be considered an offence.
That's taken us on a journey. To be fair, that has we have, as you said, set some groundwork and laid a foundation. And that took a lot for someone like myself to get my head around what is those determinations, what are the terminology, and how do we apply that and 269, all those things to incidents that happen like this.
So this time we're going to start with an incident. And Daniel, I'm going to take you and the listeners through the objective elements first. Literally, what happened.
Okay.
And then we'll add on afterwards the greater context.
It's probably fair to say, for those, we are jumping straight into this, and this could be a little disturbing, so we're giving you a little bit of a warning ahead. This is straight from witness statements, you said?
We're going to go straight into a witness statement, so please, if you're listening to this in the car, at home, have a look around at who's with you. Ask yourself whether this is appropriate content for everybody that's in your immediate listening vicinity. If you are concerned, you might want to mute the radio or turn down the podcast for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Come back again afterwards and have a listen when you can. But again, one final warning, we are going to jump straight into a witness account. Glenelg is a beachside suburb in Adelaide. Lovely, lovely place. 2 a.m, a woman wakes up to the sound of rattling at the door and assumes it's her son having forgotten his keys to the house. She opens the door to let the young man in, but he doesn't enter. Instead, he walks around to the back of the house, which she thought was strange. I said, "What are you doing? What have you got?" I didn't recognize what it was in his hand as he was coming toward me. He just pushed through me, straight for his father. He started running into the house, and I saw the knife. I chased my son into the house screaming, "He's got a knife," to warn my husband. My husband responded. He screamed out something, but I don't know what it was. I followed my son into the bedroom. I was in there, and he started stabbing my husband. My husband was in the bed, trying to get up when my son first stabbed him. I know they fought for a while, and my son just started stabbing my husband. I don't think my son said anything, and my husband sort of got up and tried to defend himself. When my son came close to me, I tried to restrain him, but he slashed at me with the knife and cut me to the back of the leg. My son ran away. I called 000 and I performed CPR on my husband until ambulance officers and police arrived. I'm going to jump ahead in time a little bit now to a taxi driver who was finishing his shift parked near a 24-hour gym not so far away. A man approached me and in a panicked voice asked, "Can you take me to the police station?" I saw that he was covered in blood. I saw it on his own hands and his own shirt. He was showing me the blood on his hands, and so I asked him about it. I asked, "Are you all right? Whose blood is that?" And he said, "I had some trouble with my father." The taxi driver refused to give him a lift, contacted the police, and a little while later the police arrested the young man. They told the young man, "We're arresting you on suspicion of an attempted murder." The police statement says the young man replies, "Attempted, so he's okay. I haven't had much sleep. I've had some pills. Do you think I need to have my stomach pumped?" A short time later, the officers are informed that the father, the husband, has died as a result of his wounds. And they tell the young man this. The young man replies, "Oh no, 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 no. OF, OF. Oh you mother effer, you died. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my effing God. Did you say I killed my father? Why would you joke about that?" The police replied that they were not joking, and the young man responds, "I'm hearing voices."
That is first-hand accounts of the incident and the objective elements, as you stated, Sean. That is somewhat chilling, and it's probably very sobering. I've said this in the past. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is not an episode of Law and Order. It's nothing of that nature. This is real life. These are circumstances that a family, like any other family within this state, city, around the country, around the world, could go through this circumstance.
And we've talked about families that have. We've talked about Michelle Chamberlain, her sister and her mother. We've talked about how difficult it is to be in that situation when someone you love has inflicted harm on someone else you love. We've also talked about that horrific moment of someone coming in the early hours of the morning, disturbing your peace and slumber, like happened to the Mombas family with their next-door neighbour, Donato Corbo. This is a confluence of those two types of circumstances.
It is. It's a coming together of all of those. It is a tragic circumstance, as we've said. We also said there's a reason we wanted to start from this perspective, because we just wanted to highlight this is a case where mental health is going to play into this, and it's going to play a big part in whether someone is deemed mentally competent of this act or not. One thing we've deliberately not done at this stage, though, is we haven't advised names or circumstances around that.
And I think right now some people out there listening are probably starting to get a bit of a tickling sensation at the base of the skull, a bit of a suspicion.
Absolutely. And if you are, you may start to have some level of familiarity or think you know what this story is. For those who aren't aware, the names involved to this are not unfamiliar to South Australia, and it's certainly a case that Sean and I recognise is probably going to divide a lot of opinion. The victim in this case was a gentleman named Phil Walsh. The accused in this case was his son, Cy Walsh. Now, as you said, Sean, a lot of people are probably just stopping in their tracks right now, putting two and two together.
Because this was immensely massive news. This was a watershed moment, not just in South Australia, but around the country, because not only did this touch on issues of mental competence and the law, but it also touched on what is arguably the single largest religious faith in this country.
Absolutely. And I touched in my introduction to this episode around the concept of cognitive dissonance, of being able to hold those two elements and objectively look at that. Because we know there is a lot of emotive response to this. And at the time, it was a huge emotional outpouring from those immediately around that family. However, from a huge wider community of our sporting nation through the Australian Football League, AFL, and everyone who has touched that. We will go into the depths of what that looked like. It's fair to say that this case, however, was unlike anything else because of that notoriety, because of that coverage, and because of the esteem that both Phil Walsh held in that world, but what that world meant emotionally to so many of us as a community.
A nation is today in mourning for a father figure lost, a hard man, a leader, a confidant, someone with the ability to nurture the talents and ambitions of the young. Phil Walsh, coach of the Adelaide Crows. That's how the Advertiser began its news coverage on July 3rd, 2015, the day that Phil Walsh was stabbed and killed by his son, Cy Walsh.
It's a really big, I guess, introduction to an article. They're words that are generally reserved for heads of state, politicians, really big community leaders. And I'm not diminishing Phil Walsh's his place in that. However,
it's an apt comparison. You're actually saying it's of the same level. And
correct.
In the newsroom that day, sitting there as a reporter, it was. It was like a president had been assassinated. It was like a prime minister had gone for a swim and never come back. It was a JFK moment. It was a Harold Holt moment. The day Phil Walsh died was probably the second biggest news day of my career, second only to 9/11.
Yeah. And if you think that sounds a little bit exaggerated or over the top, you need to put some, I guess, perspective and context. We keep coming back to those two words, and we're going to throughout this entire situation, because the AFL, or the Australian Football League, and Aussie rules football as we call it for those here in Australia, if you're not from Australia, you maybe haven't heard it, or even if you're interstate and it's not the biggest code that you play sporting-wise, you need to understand, Sean sort of aptly referred to this as, the biggest religion we have. And it truly is, to some, an absolute religion in that sense. And sitting within that, Phil Walsh held an incredibly, integral place in that space, because we are talking about a man. And to give you some gravity of this, I'm going to run through what the AFL is and the context of that, and Phil Walsh's position in that in a moment. Phil Walsh was indelibly attached to the AFL culture, not just in this state, however, across numerous states. And to give you some context, let's talk about the AFL. The Australian Football League, AFL, it is one of, if not the biggest, and it's always controversial depending who you want to talk to, the largest sporting sort of situation we have in the country. One of the largest professional sports, also definitely one of the most watched and viewed professional sports, both here in Australia and overseas. Just to give you an idea, we've got a population roughly sort of 6 million, whatever it is in this country. We have every year over 1.5 million people playing this sport. We have a national professional league. We also have, for men, we also have a semi-professional national women's league these days. To give you an idea, outside of Australia, we also have over 20 different leagues which are recognised by AFL, the governing body, as actually functioning leagues where we have around about 100,000 people, a lot of expat Australians, who are playing AFL outside of Australia as well. To give you an understanding, you can go to any community park, any oval on a weekend throughout our winter season, and you will hear the cheers, the screams, the whistles, the bumps, the boos, all of that of this religion we call AFL. It is something that is ingrained in a lot of us, many of us from a very, very young age. I say many of us, Sean, not all of us.
Well, look, I like to make lots of jokes about sports ball. We talk about it all the time. Sean knows nothing about sports, throw the stick through the hoops, score the runs, etc., etc. The truth of the matter is I'm from a football family. My grandfather was Jack Fewster, and there'll be a fair few people around who ears will prick up and say, oh, wait, he's from that group of Fewsters. Yes, I am. Jack Fewster, who was the chairman of the Lyndoch Football Club in the Gawler League back in the day, eventually the chairman of the Gawler League, a board member of the South Australian National Football League as one of its 2 country delegates. He raised an entire family of Port Adelaide supporters. He later became, ironically, a life member of the Central Districts Football Club and the South Australian National Football League, and he was a life member of the Barossa League as well. This is a man who lived, breathed, ate, slept football. My cousins still do to this day. My aunts, my uncles still do to this day. I'm the outlier in the family. I had no interest in football, no interest in competitive sports from a young age, made me the black sheep. But all of my cousins who listen to this right now are going, yeah, we know all about football. We still play it. That's the way we live our lives.
And that is really, I guess, atypical of so many of our younger generation coming up. We play that. We play it in the parks. We play it in recess and lunchtime at school, and it's just ingrained.
Well, you did. It's ingrained in you.
Look, it is. I played football from a very, very young age. Played AFL from about the age of 8 years old, and the only reason I gave it up in the end is I was about 20, and unfortunately had a couple of knee operations that stopped me. Now, I like to jokingly say I was pretty decent in my time. I knew how to play the game.
Come on, you were a state captain.
Well, I was a vice captain. When I was 17, I was the vice captain of our South Australian state amateur team. Metro went out and played country, etc. So, I like to think that I knew how to play the game a little bit, and I really enjoyed the game. It was something that, as a youngster, like so many of my friends and schoolmates, etc., is something that we were passionately involved in, was AFL football. And even when I stopped playing, certainly I was a fan and a supporter for a very, very long time after the fact. And I'm not as passionate as I used to be. I'm still a casual observer and do enjoy going to the games even to this day. Now, if that says something about me and what my, I guess, relationship is, you've talked about your family's relationship. Now think about this state that we live in South Australia. We have the best part of 1.5 million, whatever, people here. We have 2 teams from this city in our national competition. We have a national competition of 17, 18 teams, and we've got 2 of them here. We've got the Adelaide Crows and the Port Adelaide Power. Now, for anyone out there who is either of those teams who is now upset that I've mentioned both teams in the same breath, get over it. It's not about that. However, the man we're talking about, Phil Walsh, and the reason we've gone into such, I guess, elaborate backstory around that is to give you some, definition of the extent of this.
And interestingly, I've just got to call this. You said about people that will get upset about the Crows and Port being mentioned in the same breath. You have to mention the Crows and Port in the same breath when you talk about Phil Walsh.
That's
because
right.
As tribal as this
Correct.
gets, this is a man who transcended tribalism within football.
And that is the point that I was just going to make there, Sean. It is something that is unique in that sense, because this is a man who, he originally was born in Victoria, a different state to South Australia, which already puts him at odds with a lot of the football community here anyway.
Yeah, the South Australian-Victorian rivalry is very
huge,
strong.
Right? However, through his early AFL playing days of himself, he then was, became very good friends with Mark Williams, who was the Port Power coach when he came across and started coaching there. He later then went to other clubs and came back. He eventually ended up as the head coach of the Adelaide Crows. So this is a man who was really well heralded and regarded in both of these teams in our national sport. So as you said, this man, Phil Walsh, transcended that rivalry and that tribalism and really did create unity in that sense. He was well loved and revered by all across that community.
He was, according to that same article that I quoted earlier, focused and driven, a self-described hard ass who demanded and expected the very best from those in his life.
Absolutely. I'm now going to just run a little bit of the backstory of Phil, because he was that really hard-nosed, driven, hard-ass, old-style coach he was referred to as well. As I said, he was born in Victoria. He played for Collingwood, Richmond, and also the Brisbane Bears. And in fact, in 1987, in their inaugural season, he won the Brisbane Bears Best and Fairest. So this is generally a man who knew the game, could play the game, and would go on to coach really well.
Best and Fairest is nominated by the team, I think you told me off air.
Yeah, so Best and Fairest is essentially throughout the game of around about 18 odd games through a season, or 22, depending on the length of the season. Internally within your individual club, they will vote on that. And it is deemed the person who has been the best and also the fairest player, has amassed the most votes, becomes your club's best and fairest player. So essentially regarded the best player we had that year across the consistency of the season.
I'm learning.
There you go. After his playing career finished, he found himself at Geelong as the fitness coach from 1995 to 98. From 1999 to 2008, he then caught up with his friend Mark Williams, I mentioned earlier, who he'd played with at both Collingwood and Brisbane, and he brought him along on the coaching staff for Port Power. Through that time, he was part of the coaching staff when Port Power won their inaugural premiership in 2004.
That's a grand final for anyone who's following along like me.
Absolutely. So that's like the Super Bowl in the NFL, or the World Championships in baseball, all that thing. So they won the league, right? He went across to Perth, so now he's moved from it to another state. We've now seen this gentleman involved in football in Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, and now Western Australia. So his reach is absolutely where all of Australian rules football is deep in that culture. This man has been there. After leaving the West Coast Eagles in 2013, he came back to Port Power in 2014. And at the end of 2014, he was successful in securing the head coach role for the 2015 season in the Adelaide Crows. This was a changing of the guard in coaching circumstances for the Crows, and it was looked at as someone with very, very high ambition and regard of what he could offer in that sense. It would prove to be a season that was cut short, however, where we're getting to. Now, the reason we've given you all that backstory is to hopefully let you understand, for all of that regard and how highly heralded this person was, just how big the notoriety of this incident was, and at times how hard it has been for our community and the AFL community to let go of the notion of our coach and look at this for the incident by itself.
But that's not the only reason we're doing this, Daniel. On this show, we give victims a voice and we tell their stories. Phil Walsh fell victim to an incident of violence. Ultimately, it would not be ruled a crime. We know that. Mental incompetence. That's why we're talking about it. But he still fell victim to an incident of violence. What we've just told you was what was known publicly about Phil Walsh. The man, not the myth, but the legend of Phil Walsh. What I want to talk about next is the private man that Phil Walsh was. The struggles that he had, the struggles that were going on within his family, and an incident that occurred several years before he took over leadership of the Crows that completely changed his worldview and in a lot of ways set the stage for what was to come.
We are a little more comfortable and familiar now with Phil Walsh, the professional and the career-driven man that he was. You want to take us a little bit behind that and help us understand more of the father and the family man. Is that right, Sean?
Yeah, and I mean, let's start out by saying right now, good father, good family man. Not about to reveal any dark skeletons to you. This is no, and then there was a sudden twist, character assassination moment. I just want you to understand the differences between the coach and the personal man. We all have different levels to our personas, different public and private faces. This is not about denigration. This is about explanation.
And by his own admission, we're going to talk about that. He's pretty candid about who he was as a family man and a father.
Look, he was very candid, and a lot of that candor came from self-insight and self-realization. And a lot of that self-realization came from, of all things, a near-death experience. So in January of 2014, Phil Walsh opened up to one of the Tigers' football journalists about something that had happened to him in October of 2012.
Right.
He'd travelled to Cuzco, which is in Peru, to see Machu Picchu and all the tourist sites there. Part of a world trip. Phil liked to use the off-season from the AFL, and for those out there that don't understand, that's September on through to what? February-ish?
Yeah, probably a little bit shorter than that by the time pre-season kicks in. So you could probably say September-ish through to probably November, December-ish, a good couple of months break in there.
Yeah, so during that period, they like to travel overseas so that Phil could refresh his batteries, but also refresh his love of international sport. This man was not just a fan of AFL, he wanted to be involved in everything. So they'd watched soccer matches in Rio, they'd watched Penn State versus Ohio State in the US, really gotten involved. Himself, his wife Meredith, and their son, Sai. When they got to Machu Picchu, though, Phil got hit by a 12-seater minibus. And as he says, he was lying crumpled on the side of a busy street after this bus has ploughed through him. And he says, I saw the white light. I had the drowning sensation. I thought I would die.
It's a pretty harrowing account of just, as you said, you're on this end-of-season recharge trip with the family, and out of nowhere, all of a sudden, you're hit in a foreign country by a bus.
Fractured pelvis, fractured collarbone, in a hospital system that is not what you're used to in Australia, let alone being AFL connected. I mean, let's face it, if you're sporting connected in this country, you're getting better than A1 healthcare.
Correct.
At all times. You know, you pull a hangnail and somebody's going to come and fix it for you straight away. So thankfully, Phil had a secret weapon. Sai actually spoke Spanish.
Right.
Sai loved languages, loved world travel, loved languages. He spoke enough Spanish to be able to get a Skype connection sorted out so that they could speak to team doctors back in Australia. At that point, it was the West Coast Eagles team doctors, who then got the insurance companies involved, who then got the hospital connected. Next thing you know, the whole family is on a plane on their way back to Australia to heal up.
So again, we say, and quite rightly, because in that situation, you use every advantage you have available to you. Through that connection, Sai was able to speak Spanish, as you said. However, they were able to get a connection back to club doctors for an AFL club here, give him some advice, and start that ball rolling. So again, as I say, in that instance, you use every advantage you have. If you've ever been travelling overseas and something like that has happened, it's a very confronting situation.
Before they left, though, Phil had one request of Meredith. He asked her to take the camera that they were travelling with and go back to the street corner where he'd been hit and take a photo of it. He wanted a photograph of that corner to remember forever. And as he said, he made it the background on his computer so that when he opens it each morning, he's reminded to be positive. I feel like I've got a second chance a bit. I think the accident changed me. Even in my coaching, I probably realize how every moment is just so important. This was a changing of the guard for Phil, mentally, emotionally, certainly physically. He made a full recovery, but he was a changed man. He didn't drink anymore, gave up the booze. He started riding a bicycle to work every day because, as he said, life is too short to spend in a car. There's a sad amount of irony in that. He wrote down a list of what he wanted to achieve in life, and the top of the list was speaking fluent Japanese. So as he rode every day from home to work, he'd listen to the language on his headphones. Sai spoke Japanese.
Oh, okay.
And it's interesting that he picked Japanese because a big driving force in all of this for Phil was he wanted to change the way that he was a father.
Okay.
And this started trickling out in subsequent interviews. He told a journalist that a recent beach day with his son and his daughter had been, quote, almost the best day I've had ever. I lost that connection and I'm trying to connect with my son again, which I have done.
Okay.
And expanded on that a little further again. Admitted that they'd had a tumultuous relationship, that at times they had been estranged from each other. Phil even described his relationship with Sai as being neglected because of a personally destructive focus on his sporting career.
Okay.
Huge words there.
Yeah.
Huge. Personally destructive. He said, one of the biggest things I've tried to change over the years, and I haven't been very good at it, is taking work home. I remember one year I snapped at my son over something and he said, "So the footy's started again, has it, Dad?" That really rocked me. So I'm working on it. As a father, I feel that. I work in a high-pressure environment, a very demanding environment, and to remind yourself to leave it outside as you walk in the front door, to not carry those tendrils, those dregs. We've talked on this show about mental illness, my health, things like that. To remind myself to leave that at the door so I can go inside and be a family person, really difficult. Let alone something like football where you switch on the television, you switch on the radio and someone's critiquing your performance or your team's performance or what you've done that day.
Well, it's interesting you say that because you mentioned the concept of that high-pressure environment of your workplace. For those who may not be aware, the role of an AFL coach, it's not just game day and it's not just trainings. This is essentially a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week position and role and responsibility.
It's a political appointment almost.
Yes, indeed it is. You know, whatever occurs at that point, and you're navigating a team list of maybe 50 players, whether you are there in the incident that happens at 2 o'clock at a nightclub, you're the first person or one of that's going to get asked about your player's situation at whatever ungodly time of the day or night. You are also responsible for their well-being, plus the way they play, your tactics, your win-loss ratio, how you report back to the club, all of those things. So you talk about high pressure, and as you said, Phil, I mentioned before, was incredibly candid about his relationship with Si at that point, and the fact that he realised that self-damaging, he called it himself, that drive he had towards that was impacting that ability. However, he was aware enough, as he also said, to start to take steps to try and repair that and make that a stronger relationship.
One of the things that Phil said had hurt him was that he'd managed to forge strong bonds with countless teens and 20-somethings, you know, the people who were playing football for him, while at the same time his relationship with his son was deteriorating. A senior journalist said to him, "You've worked tirelessly for 15 years in off-field roles to chase your dream of being an AFL senior coach. Now you're the head coach of the Adelaide Crows. Are you a good father?" And Phil said, and I'm going to quote him here, "That's a really hard question. The bonus of me taking the Crows job is my son is 26 and my daughter is 22. So the collateral damage isn't so big." Collateral damage, what a choice of words.
Well, it shows that awareness again of, you know, what that drive has cost him at times. What he's gained, but what he's lost.
Such admirable honesty and insight.
Candid, yeah.
He said, "But have I been a good father? To my son, I had a disconnect because of footy. I lost that connection and I'm trying to reconnect with my son, which I have done. In a selfish way, I taught my daughter to surf because that's my release. So when I go surfing, I take her. Now I've got my son into it as well. And that's what I should have done a long time ago. A couple of months ago, we all went surfing together at Middleton, which is a nice little seaside town. Mm-hmm. And it was almost the best day I've had ever. We all got a wave. We went to the bakery on the way home. We smiled and laughed. And there was none of this stuff that I've got Melbourne, then the Bulldogs, then Port. Just none of that.
Yeah.
This was a man who has achieved his dream and has also realized that in chasing that dream, as he himself said, he needs to refocus and work on his family life at the same time. And again, he was not a bad dad. He was not a bad husband, a bad father, a bad anything. But divided focus had taken its toll on him.
And that is something that I'm sure there is a huge proportion of our listeners, both male and female, that can absolutely, you know, equate to that. They can absolutely resonate with that. In chasing their career, their dreams, whatever that is, something at times gets sacrificed. So I would imagine right now there's a lot of people going, I get that. In doing that, my relationships, whether they're son, daughter, partner, whatever, may have suffered. So that's really, you know, you can connect to that. I can understand where Phil's coming from in that sense. Again, very candid, very honest, very admirable to be able to open up and say that publicly.
It's an incredible amount of insight to have, and the timing of it to this day chills me. Obviously, spoiler alert, I got involved in the coverage of the crime, of the incident, of, you know, we didn't know at that time. At that time, we thought it was a crime. It later became an incident. You all know now how mental health cases work. To be digging through the Tizer archives, to educate myself in my non-football mind about who this man was, to undertake the exercise that we've undertaken in this episode thus far, to swat up on who this guy was, to find those interviews, to find that level of insight, to find those conversations being had publicly just a few months before he died. Hair's standing up on my arms now. It was really chilling.
Yeah, it is. We know this timeline. We know how this does play out, and we know, for want of a better term, what happens next. We started this episode with the objective elements of telling you what this was all about. We're at a part, as you said, that interview was mere months before Phil's untimely death, unfortunately. It is really chilling that he started to have the insight and was making those inroads as seemingly this world all fell apart. What we're going to move into next is revisiting that, having a look at how that all played out, and what part does everyone start to play in this ongoing situation that, as you rightly said, takes this from a potential crime to an incident. Sean, we started this episode by you giving us a recount of the objective elements of an incident. Throughout the rest of this episode, what we've now done is started to add layers, I guess, of the personalities involved in this. What I want you to do for us now, though, is I want you to go back, if you can, and I want you to combine these pieces together. I'd like you to give us another recount of this situation, but let's now combine the personalities with the objective elements of this retelling to see how we sit with this incident one more time.
So this comes from Meredith's witness statement of the night that her husband Phil died. She says she woke about 2 a.m. to the sound of rattling and assumed it was Si having forgotten his key to the house. Meredith says she opened the door to let him in, but he did not enter, instead walking around to the back of their house, and she thought that was strange. I said, "What are you doing? What have you got?" I didn't recognize what was in his hand as he was coming toward me. He just pushed through me, straight for his father. He started running into the house, and I saw the knife. I chased Si into the house, screaming, "Si's got a knife," to warn Phil. Phil responded. He screamed out something, but I don't know what it was. I followed Si into the bedroom. I was in there, and he started stabbing Phil. Phil was in the bed trying to get up when Si first stabbed him. I know they fought for a while, and Si just started stabbing Phil. I don't think Si said anything, and Phil sort of got up and tried to defend himself. And when Si came close to her, Meredith tried to restrain him, but he slashed her with the knife and inflicted what would later be found to be a 10 to 12 centimetre wound to the back of her leg. Si fled the scene. Meredith called 000, performing CPR on Phil until ambulance officers and police arrived. We know that Si then had the encounter with the taxi driver while he was covered with blood. He was then arrested. He surrendered peacefully to the police, saying, yeah, it's me. He told the police, "I've not had much sleep, I've had some pills," and he asks whether he needs to have his stomach pumped. Told he's being charged with attempted murder, he replies, "Attempted. He's okay." But later, when he's informed that Phil Walsh has died, he begins to cry. "Oh, no, don't. Oh, F. Oh, you mother effer, you died. Oh my God. Oh my effing God. Did you say I killed my father? Why would you joke about that?" A police officer tells him they're not joking, and Si responds, "I'm hearing voices."
That is the same incident. That is the same circumstances. It adds another level and layer when we add the personalities to that we've just spent the rest of this show expanding upon this family's environment. We now have those names: Phil, Si, and Meredith. Same story with a very different feel. And it's a very different circumstance knowing who these people are within that public eye.
Because what I want all of you out there listening to remember is that, stripped of being a football coach, stripped of being a celebrity, This is still about a father and a son and the effects of mental illness upon a family. Daniel and I have built this episode this way to make you understand and see that from a new perspective. Because as we develop this further over the episodes to come, the complexities of mental health law and family have an additional level of complexity in this case because of the context of the religion that is football and the social pressures that come with that all-consuming sporting passion.
Sean, we now know Sy is arrested at that point, and he's clearly now coming to the realization that he has caused his father's death. He's also now said, "I'm hearing voices." From this point, what happens then?
This is actually a little hard to say, so I'm going to apologize for how confronting this next bit is. From all the witness accounts, Sy begins repeatedly ramming the interview table in the police station with his head. He has to be restrained and he has to be sedated. And he actually remains sedated for the rest of that day, July 3, 2015. Meantime, news is starting to leak out. People are getting phone calls within the football community. Phil Walsh is dead. Obviously, Meredith's making calls. The network's going, like any community network. This is a community network that, of course, is tied in very closely with the media, so the word gets to the media very quickly as well. And before anybody is really even awake, this story is starting to blow up.
So remember, this incident occurs at about 2 a.m. in the morning, Friday, 3rd of July. As you said, we are a mere hours along, and that network that you talk about, if you think about that, if you've lost someone close to you, you make those phone calls to loved ones, friends, family around that. Now put on the concept that that network goes far beyond that, and it involves a community which is a sporting club, which is then within a national framework, which is then attached to media, personality.
1.5 million active players.
Correct. So all of the support situations around that. And whether we like it or not, one thing we really want to highlight here is the notoriety that something like that automatically attracts simply by the nature of who the person was. It is one thing that if this was to happen in your neighborhood and you heard about it, it would be, wow, that happened close to home.
Michelle Chamberlain.
Exactly. However, in this circumstance, this is newsworthy because it's unfortunately that personality attached to the newsworthiness of it.
Not likely did I make the comparison that this was the second largest news day of my career after 9/11. Not lightly did I make the comparison to this being like a political assassination. It was that level of shockwave, that level of stone dropped in the pond, to wake up on a Friday morning and the very first thing I hear is that the coach of the Adelaide Crows has been, at that point, allegedly murdered by his own son. I just looked at my wife and said, I'm going to be home late.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's the reaction of yourself, because not so much from that sporting perspective, you understand from the gravity of the news perspective that this is going to have in a landscape like the South Australian sporting environment. I kind of vaguely remember hearing that early on in that day and sort of shaking my head going, hang on, that doesn't happen in this arena. It doesn't happen of this nature of, I'll say, celebrity of who we know in our sport environment. This is not something that happens in the AFL community.
If a sportsman dies, it's death by misadventure. It's unfortunate. It's a car crash. It's, in a couple of cases, it's a Jack Hanley style punch.
Absolutely. It might even be a tragic sporting accident on the field, perhaps, whatever that might look like. This is not what we're in any way accustomed to. So it was a unique circumstance for so many reasons. We're going to start to unpack that because as you started to talk about, you knew that you were starting to hear the news rumblings of that. We're going to, on our next episodes, really delve into what was the reaction from all of those areas: the newsroom, the sporting community, the clubs themselves, the AFL, and the wider thought process of what we thought as the community, based on what we thought we knew at the time, with a slight twist that Sean and I are going to give you behind the scenes to hopefully understand what was really going on, where does or doesn't the responsibility lie here, and how did mental health really play a part in this situation.
No matter how many times you have looked into this story, no matter what you think you know about this story, I assure you, you do not know the full story yet.
And with that, we will come back and continue this series. It is the extension of our mental health and the legal system through one of the most topical and at times, let's say, divisive cases we could possibly touch. This is a case where we are genuinely intrigued and interested to understand the thought process and the reactions and the feedback of all those listening. We know this is going to hit home very close to some people, and we welcome that feedback because it is through that concept and that process to get the wider understanding out there that we can start to unpack how we feel versus what we see, and hopefully get to an understanding and outcome of where does mental health and the legal system converge. Until we get there, we once again want to remind you that if you think you have someone who is in a vulnerable mental state, or you are yourself, that there are available resources out there. They can help provide advice and guidance and just mental health support. For here locally in South Australia, the South Australian Government Mental Health Triage Service on 131 465. They'll offer that 24-hour a day, 7-day a week advice and guidance on the mental health emergency and crisis situations. The Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line on 131 466. If you or someone you know is in a vulnerable situation, you can call, and on behalf of yourself, they will help step them through that time.
I say again, as I've said after every one of these episodes, that can potentially be a life-saving phone call. Please do not hesitate to help someone in their moment of vulnerability.
I have seen someone I know utilize that service for that exact reason. And it is, don't say it lightly, that it is very likely it did save someone's life. For everyone who has listened to our broadcast on 5AA, or you've listened to our podcast on any of the platforms you hear them on, iTunes, Spotify, wherever that may be, please go rate, review, leave us some feedback. We'd love to hear it, and it's how you help get our message out. If you'd like to give us that feedback, please, you can do that at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can, as always, follow Sean and his work with The Advertiser and Adelaide's True Crime through Facebook and Twitter at Sean Fuster. And once again, as always, we want to remind you to enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.